In 1962, the world held its breath as the major powers, the US and the Soviet Union, were minutes away from nuclear war. Stick around until the end to learn about the Soviet submarine officer that saved the world from nuclear war. It became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and although it lasted less than 2 weeks, it was the closest the world came to World War III. Cuba was previously an ally of the US until 1959, with the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista being anti-communist in his policies. He was overthrown and replaced by Fidel Castro, who wanted to remove the presence of the US from Cuba. He was motivated to serve the poor people of Cuba, and this made him popular among Cubans. First, he nationalized many US-owned businesses in Cuba and put in place many socialist reforms. This gained the support from the Soviet Union. It caused concern for the US as their foreign policy was focused on stopping the spread of communism. In 1961, John F. Kennedy planned an invasion of Cuba to attempt to overthrow Castro. Instead of using US troops, which would be seen as an act of aggression, he would sponsor 1,500 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba along the Bay of Pigs. Castro's 20,000 strong army defeated them in 3 days, with over 100 dead and the rest fleeing or surrendering. After this, Castro agreed to secretly house Soviet Union nuclear missiles and 40,000 troops here in Cuba. This helped the Soviet Union close the missile gap, as the US had missiles in Turkey. So now, both sides had missiles close to each other's borders. For Cuba, it protected them from US invasion. It didn't take long for the US to find out when a plane flew over Cuba and discovered a nuclear missile launch site. They responded by blockading all ships to Cuba apart from essentials such as food. JFK announced to the US public what was happening and declared that any use of weapons would see full retaliation. The Soviet Union saw the blockade as an act of aggression and responded by saying the Soviet ships would not stop for US ships. Tension was rising as the nuclear launch sites were nearly ready for use. The crisis almost came to a head when Soviet vessels possibly carrying missiles were reported near the blockade line. They changed course, showing that Khrushchev was taking the blockade seriously. On the 26th of October, Khrushchev sent a message to the US saying that he would be willing to remove his missiles if they promised not to invade Cuba. However, the following day Khrushchev sent another message more aggressive than the last. It made another demand for the US to withdraw their nuclear missiles from Turkey for an agreement to be made. On the same day, 2 things happened. First was news of an American spy plane being shot down over Cuba. Some of JFK's colleagues called for military action in response, but he kept his cool. The second incident happened when an American ship dropped a depth charge to signal submarines to identify themselves. One depth charge hit close to a Soviet submarine. Those on the submarine didn't know whether the war had started because they were too deep to be able to communicate with Moscow. The captain had decided that war had broken out and wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. This submarine needed the approval of 3 officers to launch a nuclear attack: the captain, political officer, and the executive officer Vasily Arkhipov. The 3 argued about the decision, with 2 wanting to launch and Vasily refusing. All 3 needed to unanimously agree to launch. Vasily's decision to not launch saved the world. Above water, JFK sent his brother to negotiate with the Soviet Union ambassador. They informed the Soviet Union that the US already planned to remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey. They asked this information to remain top secret. The Soviet Union agreed, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. They would remove missiles and troops from Cuba, and the US would remove missiles from Turkey and not invade Cuba. The world could breathe after the sobering experience of becoming so close to nuclear war. Let me know in the comments if you liked the video, and thanks for watching.